formalized a major nuclear agreement with Russia. Will now collaborate with Ibrahim Traore-led Burkina Faso to develop nuclear infrastructure for peaceful purposes. The announcement was made by Burkina Faso's Minister of Energy, Yakuba Zabre Gauba, and this during a media interview where he said that the deal represents the final administrative step in a broader framework of nuclear cooperation between the two countries. Now, the agreement aims to help Burkina Faso to diversify its energy sources and to address the country's chronic electricity shortages. Burkina Faso is one of the world's least electrified countries. Under the deal, Rosatom will support the construction of nuclear power plants, research reactors, and will provide critical services across the nuclear fuel cycle. The deal follows Russia's approval last week of similar nuclear arrangements with Mali, another junta-led neighbor in the Sahel region. For Moscow, these agreements are a part of a larger strategy to strengthen its footprint in Africa. Though through Rosatom, Russia has been expanding its nuclear presence across the continent.
The world woke up to a headline no one expected. Africa had just replaced the United States in a global market worth billions of dollars. It wasn't speculation. It wasn't a prediction. It wasn't a future scenario. It had already happened. By the time Washington understood what was going on, the contracts were already signed, the ships were already moving, the money was already flowing, and the new alliances were already locked in. For decades, America held a comfortable position in global trade, supply, finance, and strategic minerals. Even when other nations rose, the U.S. still dictated the pace, the rules, and the direction. But this time, Africa wasn't following the old playbook, and what unfolded caught the West completely off guard. Because Africa wasn't just exporting raw materials anymore. It wasn't just hosting foreign corporations. It wasn't just participating. Africa was now controlling the market itself, and billions of dollars were suddenly shifting from the United States to the African continent. The transformation didn't happen in a single day. It began with a quiet but powerful trend. African nations started demanding better deals. Not loans, not aid, not assistance. Deals, real partnerships, full ownership, full control. And while Western nations were still debating policy and still proposing old-style frameworks that gave them the upper hand, Africa turned its focus toward new partners, new technologies, new financing models, and new regional alliances. That's how it began, with a simple decision, to stop waiting for the West and start building for itself. Washington underestimated this shift. Analysts described it as temporary. Commentators called it symbolic. Economists said Africa didn't have the infrastructure or the coordination to move markets. But they were wrong, because in just 4 years, Africa quietly built one of the most powerful regional economic engines in the world. And no one in Washington saw the full scale of it until it was too late. The first sign was in the minerals market. African nations began reorganizing their mining sectors, renegotiating extraction rights, and forcing Western companies to operate under new rules. At first, U.S. corporations resisted. They expected Africa to back down. But Africa didn't, and instead, they turned to new buyers, especially in Asia and the Middle East, who were willing to pay far more for the same resources. This single move redirected hundreds of millions of dollars away from U.S. companies and into African state-owned enterprises. But minerals were just the beginning. The real shock came when Africa took over a market the U.S. relied on for decades: strategic food supply and agricultural exports. While American farms were dealing with labor shortages, rising debt, fertilizer costs, and collapsing profits, African agricultural powerhouses were expanding, modernizing, and exporting at record levels. Nations like Kenya, Ethiopia, South Africa, Tanzania, and Nigeria began to dominate markets the U.S. used to control. When global buyers needed stable suppliers, Africa stepped in. When U.S. producers struggled to fill orders, Africa filled the gap. When shipping delays hit American ports, African trade corridors moved faster. Slowly, billions shifted from U.S. farms to African exporters, and the U.S. government didn't understand the scale until it saw the trade reports. Washington called it a temporary disruption. But it wasn't. It was a structural shift. Because African nations had something America didn't: a young workforce, expanding farmland, rapidly modernizing irrigation, and a continent-wide push to feed the world. For global buyers, stability matters more than politics. And Africa was offering exactly that. Meanwhile, the U.S. was dealing with domestic problems that were impossible to ignore. ICE raids removed thousands of farm workers, shutting down meat plants. Fertilizer prices soared. Machinery grew more expensive. Small farms collapsed under debt. Hundreds of thousands of acres were abandoned. America wasn't just losing competitiveness. It was losing the fundamentals required to stay in the market. Africa stepped in with confidence. And then came the deal. The billion-dollar deal that changed everything. A coalition of African nations signed a massive multi-year supply contract with key global partners, one that previously belonged to U.S. companies. This wasn't a rumor. This wasn't speculation. It was formal, strategic, and irreversible. The contract instantly redirected billions in trade from the U.S. to Africa. Washington officials called emergency meetings. Analysts tried to understand how the U.S. could lose such a major market. But the answer was simple. Africa didn't steal anything. Africa won it. Because Africa was offering something the U.S. no longer could: stability, scalability, and competitive pricing built on modernizing industries, not struggling ones. The American media blamed foreign influence. Some blamed politics. Some blamed farmers. But the truth was deeper. The U.S. was facing an internal agricultural crisis, while Africa was rising with a unified regional strategy. Global buyers simply followed the stronger supplier. Washington had no strategy to counter it. No alternative to offer. No leverage left. Because Africa wasn't just exporting. Africa was controlling the market from production to logistics to final sale. That was the moment Washington realized Africa was no longer a participant. It was a competitor. And Africa was winning. The shock inside the U.S. government grew even stronger when additional countries lined up to sign similar contracts with Africa. Europe, the Middle East, parts of Asia. They all saw the same thing. The U.S. was becoming unreliable. Africa was becoming essential. And just like that, billions more shifted. This wasn't just economics. This was global power, and the balance was changing faster than anyone expected. As Washington scrambled for solutions, Africa continued expanding. Ports were modernized. New export zones were built. New trade corridors opened. African currencies stabilized. Regional banks strengthened. And new supplies of critical minerals, agricultural products, and manufacturing goods continued pouring into global markets. Africa wasn't waiting for recognition. Africa was taking its position. By the time U.S. officials attempted to renegotiate their way back into the market, Africa had already moved on. New buyers, new partners, new rules. And the U.S. was no longer in the center of the game. This wasn't symbolic. This was structural, permanent. A new chapter in global trade. Africa had replaced the U.S. in a market worth billions, and Washington didn't see it coming. The story didn't end with Africa simply taking the U.S. market share. That was only the beginning. What followed was a carefully orchestrated consolidation of power, influence, and strategic advantage that completely reshaped global trade dynamics and left Washington scrambling to understand what had just happened. After the initial billions shifted, African nations began to implement regional coordination that the world had never seen before. African Union leaders convened a secret summit, not just to talk about trade, but to design a framework for Africa to control the full value chain of the market they had just captured. The focus wasn't on dependency, it was on independence. For decades, Western nations had dictated pricing, supply chains, and investment priorities in Africa. Now, the script had been flipped. Africa was dictating the terms. The next move came in infrastructure and logistics. Ports, railways, and trade corridors were upgraded at record pace. Shipping lanes were optimized to reduce delivery times and costs, allowing African exports to reach global markets faster than ever before. While U.S. exporters were slowed by labor shortages, supply chain bottlenecks, and rising fuel costs, African shipments arrived on time, reliably, and at competitive prices. The message was clear: Reliability is king in global trade, and Africa was now the kingmaker. At the same time, technology and finance became critical weapons. African nations partnered with private tech firms and regional banks to create digital payment and tracking systems for trade. These systems offered transparency and security that global buyers hadn't experienced with U.S. exporters in years. Bitcoin, mobile banking, and blockchain tracking were used to move money and goods seamlessly. The U.S. financial system, burdened with bureaucracy and outdated mechanisms, could not match the speed or efficiency. Global investors began to shift their trust to Africa's emerging financial networks. Washington's response was slow, cautious, and reactive. Emergency meetings were convened, advisors scrambled to propose counter-strategies, and analysts warned of long-term consequences. But each attempt to reclaim market share was outmaneuvered by Africa's coordinated approach. Unlike U.S. policy, which was fragmented and influenced by internal politics, Africa acted with unified purpose. Every new move was calculated to expand influence, diversify partnerships, and ensure that no single Western power could interfere. Energy independence was another critical factor. African nations had invested heavily in renewable energy and hydropower. The surplus electricity was used not only to power cities and factories, but to support energy-intensive industries such as mining, cryptocurrency production, and advanced manufacturing. With low-cost, abundant energy, African companies undercut global competitors, delivering goods at prices the U.S. and Europe could not match. This energy strategy also attracted foreign investors who sought stable and cost-efficient production hubs. Agriculture became the next frontier. As U.S. farms struggled with labor shortages, high debt, and climate-related disruptions, Africa expanded farmland using modern techniques, mechanized farming, precision irrigation, and high-yield seeds. Countries like Kenya, Ethiopia, and Nigeria began exporting staples such as wheat, maize, and soybeans at volumes and quality levels that rivaled American output. Where the U.S. had previously dominated the global market, Africa now held a competitive advantage. Millions of tons of food, previously sourced from the U.S., were redirected to African exporters, and Washington could do little to stop it. The global reaction was mixed. Europe saw a chance to diversify supply chains and reduce dependency on the U.S. China welcomed an alternative source of minerals and agricultural goods. Middle Eastern nations invested in African infrastructure and trade corridors. Africa's rise wasn't just economic, it was geopolitical. The world was recalibrating around a continent that had long been underestimated. Inside the United States, panic grew. Government officials admitted in private briefings that they had misjudged Africa's speed and strategy. Reports leaked of multi-billion-dollar contracts lost, industries downsizing, and trade deficits widening in critical markets. Corporate executives lobbied Congress for emergency support, warning that entire sectors could collapse if they did not regain footing in African markets. Meanwhile, African nations were not content with only one victory. They were expanding into technology, finance, and industrial sectors, creating entire ecosystems that made their markets indispensable. Partnerships with Asia, the Middle East, and Europe solidified Africa's position as a global hub. New investment zones, free trade agreements, and resource-sharing strategies ensured that Africa retained control over the markets the U.S. had once dominated. One of the most remarkable aspects of this shift was Africa's ability to coordinate regionally without external interference. Decisions that might take years in Washington due to bureaucracy and politics were implemented in months. Regional banks, trade associations, and intergovernmental councils acted swiftly to finalize contracts, implement infrastructure upgrades, and support local industries. The efficiency gap between Africa and the United States grew wider with each passing month. The human factor was also critical. Africa's young workforce, tech-savvy entrepreneurs, and urbanizing population contributed to innovation, production, and exports at a scale that American labor shortages simply could not match. Meanwhile, demographic challenges in the U.S., combined with immigration restrictions, exacerbated domestic weaknesses. The contrast was stark, one continent rising with coordinated energy and youthful labor, another struggling with outdated infrastructure and political gridlock. By 2025, the outcome was undeniable. Africa had not only replaced the U.S. in a market worth billions, but it had reshaped global supply chains, financial systems, and trade relationships. Washington realized that no quick fix could reverse the shift. Recovery would require long-term strategy, investment, and cooperation, something that would take years to implement. The final piece of the puzzle was perception. Africa framed this shift not as a hostile takeover, but as strategic self-determination. Global buyers, investors, and partners saw Africa as stable, reliable, and forward-thinking. America, despite its legacy, was increasingly seen as vulnerable, bureaucratic, and reactive. Influence, reputation, and power had shifted. As analysts in Washington scrambled to draft new policies, lobbyists pleaded for intervention, and corporations tried to regain lost ground, Africa continued moving forward. Ports were expanded, energy networks upgraded, digital finance systems implemented, and trade alliances strengthened. Africa had not only replaced the U.S., it had established a new global standard. This was more than economics. It was a power shift, a structural rebalancing of global influence. And while the United States reacted, Africa acted. Fast, unified, and decisively. By the end of 2025, the story was clear. Africa had turned opportunity into power, and billions of dollars that once flowed through the United States now coursed through African economies. Washington knew it could no longer dictate terms. The new game was here, and Africa was leading. And for those watching closely, this was only the beginning. Markets, governments, and industries worldwide would now have to adjust to a reality where Africa wasn't just a participant. It was a dominant player shaping the rules of global trade. The lesson? Power, influence, and wealth are no longer guaranteed by history. They are earned by strategy, coordination, and decisive action. Africa had shown the world exactly how it's done.